Hey, it's Ezekiel here, and today's walking tour is at Lincoln Castle, which was constructed in the late 11th century by William the Conqueror. The Romans who first settled at the top of the hill established a fortress here soon after the invasion in 43 AD. Over the years, Lincoln bears scars of bloody battles and sieges, until the last besiege in 1644, during the English Civil War, when the royalist holding it was overwhelmed by a mightier parliamentarian force. In 1215, the charter of the Magna Carta was read out at the Sheriff's Court in Lincoln Castle, before being placed in the Cathedral treasury for safekeeping and retained in Lincoln ever since. It is one of 4 surviving. Between 1817 and 1859, executions by hanging took place on the roof. Today, the Gothic Revival courthouse, which was built in 1826 for the Lincolnshire Assizes, is now Lincoln Crown Court. From 2010 to 2015, Lincoln underwent a major £22 million restoration project and is now open to the general public. Still today, the main entrance to the castle was built to serve the inner bailey. The current east gate stands at the top of Steep Hill, facing the cathedral and the marketplace in the upper town. But if the original Norman castle extended across the whole upper town, then the original Norman east gate must have reused the Roman east entrance. Well to the far side of the cathedral, an excavation had supplied considerable evidence that the east and Norman Roman gates were both substantially rebuilt in the early Norman era, the east gate retaining a typically Roman but non-Norman double arch, creating 2 carriageways. When the castle was reduced in size and the walls rebuilt in stone, a new east gate was needed, and the earliest stonework found here is thought to be of a late 11th century. The rounded stone portal characteristics of earlier Norman work can still be seen behind the later pointed archway of the gateway. A drawbridge would have led across the wide ditch that encircled the castle, although the porous limestone bedrock meant that the ditch never held water, and a portcullis would have protected the entrance. Castle records from 1224 to 1225 show that an additional defence in the form of 2 barbican towers were added to the east gate, probably in response to the damage caused by the siege of 1191 and the Second Battle of Lincoln in 1217. The sheriff was still under orders to finish it in 1227. However, so clearly the urgency faded. These towers later fell into disrepair. Lincoln Castle is one of the grandest Norman castles in England. It is unusual in having 2 keeps and a complete curtain wall, and its highly strategic position has given it a continuing historical importance. It seems that it was the Romans who first settled at the top of the hill, establishing a legionary fortress here soon after the invasion of 43 AD. As the area became more settled and the army moved on, this developed into a colony of veterans. Excavation has shown that the Roman settlement at the top of the hill was a substantial one, entirely filling the area enclosed by the Roman walls, and boosted many of the luxuries associated with Roman civilization, including baths and underfloor heating, while later development spread down and beyond the Brayford Pool. The remains of the Roman West Gate were discovered embedded in the castle earthworks in 1836, and in 1846, when deep foundations were being dug for the felon's wing of the prison, a fine Roman mosaic was discovered and recorded in a drawing. The fine Gothic Revival building near the West Gate was built as an administrative centre for county business and a court of law in 1826, to a design by Sir Robert Smirke, who was also responsible for the British Museum building. It replaced an earlier courthouse dating from 1776, which suffered from subsidence, and which in turn replaced the old Shire Hall, which stood in the middle of the Bailey. It was built for the twice yearly sittings of the Lincolnshire Assizes, visiting judges who heard the most serious cases. The Criminal Assizes Court dealt with major crimes such as murder, rape, theft and forgery, and punishments including hanging and transportation. Today, the building is still used as Lincoln Crown Court. The Normans were as swift as the Romans to recognise and fortify a good defensible position within 2 years of his victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. In response to continuing resistance in the north, William I made a real northwards progress, ordering the construction of castles at Warwick, Nottingham and York, and then he returned south at Lincoln, Huntingdon and Cambridge, effectively establishing Norman control over the eastern half of the country. Early Norman castles usually consisted of a defensive, initially wooden tower on an artificial hill, the motte, within a large enclosure surrounded by ditch and rampart, the Bailey. The mound of the Lucy Tower was the original Norman motte, and the Norman Bailey was once assumed to have been the size of the current castle grounds, but recent scholarship and excavation has forced a rethink. It now seems that the extent of the first castle was larger than the current Bailey. If so, the outer Bailey of the first castle could have included the whole upper city, the area still known as the Bale, and the grand new cathedral that was begun soon after would have originally have stood within the boundaries of the royal castle. The massive earth ramparts and curtain wall that we see today are now believed to date mainly from the late 11th century, when the castle was largely rebuilt and probably also reduced to its current size. A stone keep, the Lucy Tower, was built on the original motte in the southwest corner of the newly defined Inner Bailey, and a second and smaller motte was constructed in the southeast corner to carry the observatory tower. The east and west gates date from much the same time, and Cobb Hall is possibly a little bit later. In Norman and medieval times, the West Gate, which was identical in form to the original East Gate, would have been much more significant than it appears today, because it led out into open country. A document of 1101 to 1115 describes the construction of a new exodus in the city walls, made for the bishop, and it is possible that this refers to the building of the West Gate. During the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, it played a crucial role, being used by royalist forces to gain access to the besieged castle when the invading French were installed in the town below. The first gate seems to have been constructed on top of the old Roman wall and rampart, so that the roadway led steeply up to the gate and then dropped down into the castle bailey. But by the mid-14th century, the ground level within the castle had risen so much, with building works, that it was level with the base of the Norman archway. On the outside, it seems that there was originally a timber gallery, supported on deep buttresses on either side of the entrance, whose remains can still be seen, as you can see the upper doorway that gave access to the gallery. This was soon converted into a barbican, with the addition of a low rectangular tower on the north side, and probably at the same time a second gate arch was added within the passageway to carry a portcullis. Records show that £54 was spent in 1233 to 1234 on fortifications here, which gives us a likely date for this major reconstruction after the damage by the siege and battle. The West Gate was blocked up in the 15th century, only finally being cleared and reopened in the early 1990s, and over time the walls and banks became unstable. The land adjoining the wall and ditch were later sold off by the Crown and built on, and the Strudler's Inn, so called for its grim view of the roof of Cobb Hall, where executions took place, was one property that backed onto the rampart. When the landlord decided to extend in 1836, his digging revealed the original Roman West Gate, but its remains were lost again when the sides of the excavation trench fell in. This is the bathhouse, which was built in 1810 to serve as the prison laundry. Women prisoners were expected to work in here, but only if they were 30 years old or above. It was feared that younger women would be corrupted by having to wash men's underwear. As a military centre, the castle and its knights were under the immediate command of a royal official, the constable, while the administration of the country as a whole fell to another royal appointee, the sheriff, who collected the king's taxes and heard lawsuits in a shire hall within the castle grounds. A much sought after appointment, the post of constable seems to have swung for almost 100 years between two competing families, one possibly with Anglo-Saxon links, and both claiming through female inheritance. The De la Haye family first appears in documents only in 1155, when Henry II confirms Richard de la Haye's right to all the lands and the constableship of Lincoln Castle, as held by his father Robert, but the claim was long-standing. Robert was a Norman, but seems to have held the constableship through his wife Muriel, daughter and heir of Colswyn, one of only two native Englishmen to hold lands directly from William I at the time of the Domesday Survey. During the reign of Stephen, from 1135 to 1154, however, the post of constable passed to the family of the Earl of Chester. A charter from Stephen to Ranulph, 4th Earl of Chester, acknowledges that Ranulph's mother Lucy, and therefore he by extension has a hereditary right to the constableship. This is Cobb Hall, probably built between 1190 and 1220. It was horseshoe-shaped, rather than round, with its flat side facing into the castle bailey, and positioned to guard the northeast sector of the wall and rampart. It had deeply recessed arrow slits in its walls on 3 levels, covering every angle of approach. The huge bust of George III, which stands near the south wall, was once part of a full-length 15-foot statue made from a special type of fired clay called Code stone, from its inventor Eleanor Code. It was commissioned by the 4th Earl of Buckingham as part of the celebrations for George III's Golden Jubilee in 1809 and placed on top of Dunstan Pillar in the grounds of Dunstan Manor. The statue was removed in 1941 as a danger to RAF aircraft from Lincolnshire's wartime airfields, and the bust has been restored for display in the grounds, while the rest of the statue is in store. The Great Stone Curtain Wall, which is still one of the most dramatic features of the castle today, was constructed on top of an earth rampart to encircle the inner bailey of the 12th century castle, and was in turn surrounded by a rock-cut ditch. One of the triumphs of the Lincoln Castle Reveal project has been the creation of a complete wall walk, and this in turn has allowed a certain amount of archaeological investigation of the structure of the whole curtain wall, although it has been much restored and rebuilt over centuries. The south wall still remains the remnant of a medieval parapet on its northern face, and a 13th century sallyport door can be seen halfway along the north wall. The west wall forms one of the most impressive stretches, with large areas of herringbone masonry, suggesting a late 11th century or early 12th century construction. Other areas of herringbone, for example on the interiors of the south and north walls, are either Victorian or modern additions. Between 1817 and 1859, 38 condemned prisoners were hanged on wooden gallows constructed on the tower's roof. These public executions were watched by vast crowds outside the castle walls. Part of the metalwork that secured the scaffold can still be seen. The name may derive from cobs, stone cannonballs found there. Cobb Hall may originally have a third storey, which could have contained a suite of rooms. From the lower storey, two doors, now blocked up, opened onto the rampart outside the castle walls, possibly serving as sally ports to allow the defending garrison to attack an approaching enemy. The upper level is pretty grand, with a fine vaulted ceiling suggesting it was used for ceremonial as well as military purposes. The lower level can now be reached by a hatch in the floor, which led to the assumption that it was intended as a dungeon, but it may rather have been built as the crypt below a chapel. An earlier 19th century visitor recorded that deserters from the army had in the past been confined here, which may account for some of the graffiti found on the walls, or they may have been carved by the garrison installed here. This could have been a dungeon or a storehouse for valuables in the medieval period. Convicted murderers Pickett and Carey were the last prisoners publicly hanged at Lincoln Castle. The hangings on Cobb Hall gallows attracted laughing, jeering crowds numbering 15,000. Pub landlords charged 3p to watch from their upstairs windows. Opinion about public executions was divided. Supporters defended them as a deterrent and a great moral teacher. Opponents deployed the uncivilised mobs who came for the grotesque spectacle. Nearly 10 years later, an Act of Parliament ended public hangings. Executions subsequently took place within the castle walls. The red brick Georgian gaol replaced an earlier gaol deemed not fit either for the safe or healthy custody of the prisoner. When philanthropist and penal reformer John Howard had visited in 1776, he found prisoners kept there in dungeons that were dirty and offensive. The magistrates appointed William Lunley to build the new gaol, which included a chapel, infirmaries and a washhouse. Today only the front section of the Georgian gaol remain, as the rest was demolished to make way for the Victorian prison. The struggle for the throne between Stephen and his cousin Matilda, daughter and chosen heir of Henry I, and the grim and prolonged period of anarchy that resulted gave Countess Lucy's son, Ranulph of Chester, the chance to exercise his mother's claim, and with his half-brother William to seize Lincoln in December 1140. Stephen's army then laid siege to the castle, but prepared for battle when Ranulph, who had secretly left the castle, returned with reinforcements, led by the Earl of Gloucester, who was Ranulph's father-in-law and also Matilda's brother. These were tricky times. The Royalists began engagement on horseback with lancers, as if for a joust, hence the title, The Joust of Lincoln, but the battle ended in hand-to-hand fighting, in which Stephen was captured. Later released in exchange for Gloucester, Stephen finally came to terms with Ranulph, who was too powerful to ignore. Lucy Tower stands on the site of the first castle, built by the Normans. The stone tower was originally 1 story higher and capable of being defended separately from the rest of the castle. It contained the Constable of Lincoln's castle's living quarters, which were constructed in timber. By 1829, the walls enclosed a burial ground. The graves of prisoners buried there, who had been hanged or had died of natural causes, still lie within. The Lucy Tower is a polygonal shell keep, a stone wall surrounding open space at the top of a mound. Shell keeps a relatively early transitional stage from a wooden palisade, and this fits with the latest thinking that the Lucy Tower mound is the original Norman one, set in a dominant position on the cliff edge in the southwest corner of the castle bailey. Timber buildings would probably originally have been built against the inside of the wall, although the name Lucy is first associated with this tower in documents from the 18th century. It is assumed to be the tower fortified by the Countess Lucy, mentioned in King Stephen's Charter, to Lucy's son, the Earl of Chester, since Lucy was herself both the daughter and the wife of Sheriffs of Lincoln, and a wealthy woman in her own right. The surviving walls have been reduced in height, but they still contain two original entrances, the main gate on the northeast side and a smaller one to the south. There is no definitive evidence as to the keep's date, but the decorative mouldings on the main entrance is typical of work from the first half of the 12th century. By the early 19th century, the interior of the keep was derelict, and the space began to be used as a burial place for those unfortunates who had been executed in the prison or had died of natural causes there, even though it was not a consecrated area. The earliest recorded burial was of Thomas Lister in March 1829, apparently because no space could be found in a churchyard, and others followed until 1847. These included Mary Ann Milner, who was sentenced to death for poisoning her sister-in-law, but hanged herself with a red silk neckerchief the night before she was due to be executed, and 3-week-old Benjamin Peacock, whose mother gave birth to him while she was in Lincoln, convicted of theft. While the succession of Henry II, the post of Constable of Lincoln Castle reverted to Richard de la Haye, then through his daughter Nicola to her husband Gerard, and on Gerard's death in 1214 back to Nicola. When Richard I inherited the throne in 1189, Nicola and Gerard made a point of travelling to his court in Normandy to obtain a charter confirming their inheritance. Clearly, royal favour could not be taken for granted, and indeed Nicola and Gerard fell thoroughly out of favour with Richard in 1191, when they supported Richard's younger brother, John, in his challenge to the authority of Royal Chancellor William Longchamps, ruling while Richard was on a crusade in the Holy Land. Lincoln Castle served as a prison from the outset, but earlier prison buildings within the bailey had come and gone, leaving no visible trace. The present building dates from 1788, with a Victorian extension designed by W.A. Nicholson and completed in 1848, and remained in use until the prison closed in 1878. The Georgian gaol initially held both debtors and criminals, but in 1848 the felons' block were replaced with the forbidding Victorian gaol, designed for the separate system, which was supposed to keep the prisoners in almost total isolation from each other. Although it was never fully introduced at Lincoln, the intention of the separate system was to prevent the evils of association and to encourage rehabilitation, and the new cells were well equipped with toilets, basin, hammock, table and stool. The chapel most closely reflects the potentially chilling effect of the separate system. It was ingeniously designed so that each prisoner occupied a seat enclosed by tall hinged screens. The prisoner filed in one by one, and the wardener then locked the screens in place so that no human contact was possible, and only the pulpit was visible. There were separate exercise yards for men and women, where convicts were given a brief daily airing. One of them was used in the prison scenes for the hugely successful television series Downton Abbey. Prisoners were expected to work on a series of monotonous tasks: picking oakum, unravelling old ropes for reuse, pumping water to fill the cisterns, and making straw mats and repairing shoes. Although the building had the latest heating and ventilation systems, the interior became intolerably hot and foul-smelly soon after it opened. The contemporary view was that staff did not operate the vent systems correctly, and both prisoners and staff fell ill. The basement level contained windowless punishment cells, bathrooms, wash house, and the male turnkeys and female matron kitchens equipped with range ovens. The Siege of Lincoln in 1191. Longchamp's forces besieged Lincoln, which was gallantry held by Nicola alone, since Gerard was with Prince John. The contemporary chronicler, Richard of Devise, describes how she, proposing to herself nothing womanish, defended the castle like a man. The siege lasted 40 days, but in the end peace was negotiated. Initially, Gerard retained his post of sheriff and constable, but lost them when Richard returned to England in 1194 and was heavily fined by the king. He was finally reinstated when John succeeded to the throne in 1199. The observatory tower is built on the smaller of the two mounds that abut the south curtain wall, which is dated a little later than the Lucy Tower. Excavation through the tower floor and into the mound itself showed that the rubble core of the mound and the original tower foundation had been constructed in a single sequence in the 12th or possibly 13th century, while pottery fragments found in the mound are no earlier than the mid-12th century. So when and why was the second tower built at Lincoln? A possible clue lies in the charter that King Stephen issued to Ranulph, Earl of Chester, which gave him leave to strengthen one of his towers in the castle of Lincoln, apparently distinguishing this from the Lucy Tower. Perhaps Ranulph, in the days of civil war and before the construction of the Barbican, needed an additional watchtower in the southeast corner of the wall to guard the approach to the east gate. The quirky turret was added in the early 19th century, possibly as part of then prisoner Governor John Merryweather's rebuilding work, here and on the Cobb Hall. Merryweather was a keen amateur astronomer, as we know from the autobiography of a contemporary prisoner, Samuel Bamford, from 1788 to 1872, a radical thinker from Middleton in Lancashire, who was charged with treason, but then sentenced to a year in Lincoln Gaol in 1819 to 1820 for inciting a riot. He had led a contingent to the meeting for parliamentary reform in St. Petersfield, Manchester, which resulted in the Peterloo massacre. The tower is first referred to as the Observatory in 1827, so the name may well have derived from Merryweather's stargazing habits. After 1206, John's domestic policies became more aggressive. He was trying to raise the funds to regain Normandy and Anjou, which had finally been lost to the French by then. Growing opposition among his more powerful subjects led to rebellion in 1215, and in turn to John's agreement to Magna Carta, a radical and unprecedented document which curbs the arbitrary exercise of royal power and guaranteed certain rights and civil liberties for the better ordering of our kingdom. To no one we will sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Magna Carta proclaimed the principle of equal access for all free men to the law of the land, though admittedly at time when the majority of the population was unfree. As part of the process of enforcing the Charter, a committee of 25 barons was established to monitor its observance and, if necessary, to seek redress from the king for any breach. It was also to be read out in public throughout the country, and copies were approved and sent out for this purpose. The charter made for Lincoln, by now one of the largest and richest cities in England, based on the wool. Today, Lincoln's Magna Carta is normally displayed in a specially created space within the site of the old Victorian prison block. Like the three other surviving copies, one in Salisbury Cathedral, two in the British Library, it is on a single sheet of parchment, but the text of each varies slightly, evidence that there were copies by different clerks. On the back, the word Lincolnia appears twice. The name Magna Carta means the Great Charter, was only used after 1217, when it was reissued in the name of Henry III, John's 9-year-old son, alongside a new document, the Charter of the Forest. This extended several clauses in Magna Carta and specified greater freedom in relation to the harsh forest laws, which applied exclusively to the royal hunting forests. Together, the two documents became known as the Charters of Liberties. If the king was seen to be exceeding his powers, there would be calls to uphold the charters. Despite the grant of Magna Carta, John and the barons soon fell out again, with John writing to the Pope, demanding to be released from an oath made under duress. In 1216, the rebellious barons took the extraordinary steps of inviting Prince Louis, eldest son of the French king, England's traditional enemy, to invade and claim the throne. Louis landed in May and soon had control of London and most of eastern England. Lincoln under Nicole de la Hayes. Gerard had died in 1214, remained loyal to John. A story recorded 60 years later tells that when John visited the castle in 1216, just 2 weeks before his death, Nicola by then, like the formidable Countess Lucy before her, an old woman of 60 plus, offered to yield the keys of the castle to him, to which he gallantly responded, "My beloved Nicola, I will that you keep the castle as hitherto, until I shall order otherwise." And so she did, withstanding French siege and holding the castle for the crown, only finally resigning her office in 1226. By May 1217, the invading French army under the Count of Perche had overrun the city of Lincoln, with the support of Gilbert de Gaunt, created Earl of Lincoln by Prince Louis, and were laying siege to the castle. Royalist forces, under the new young King Henry III's regent, William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, approached from the west. Aided by an envy from inside the castle, an elite detachment of archers managed to enter the castle via the west gate, which gave access outside the city walls, and harried the French in the city below from the battlements. This distraction allowed the Royalist army to burst through the city north gate, now the Newport Arch, and there were fierce fighting in front of the Cathedral, where the Count de Perche was killed, and the French were gradually driven back down the hill and across the Witham. Lincoln Castle had played a crucial role in the ending of the Civil War. The title of Constable continued to descend to the heirs of Nicola de la Haye until it reached Alice de Lacy, daughter and heiress of the 3rd Earl of Lincoln and Countess of Salisbury, and Constable of Lincoln through her mother, another wealthy and powerful woman. She aligned Lincoln to the earldom of Lancaster through her marriage in 1311 to Thomas, 2nd Earl. By then the castle seems to have fallen into considerable disrepair. The inspection recommended £1,000 worth of repairs, which is around £500,000 in today's terms, but there's no documentary evidence that this was ever spent. In 1351, Edward made Henry Duke of Lancaster and granted his duchy palace status, giving him substantial administrative powers independent of the crown. The duchy's manorial court for the ward of the castle and the liberty of Lincoln was held in the castle, which also continued to house the Shire Hall and the county gaol. Henry IV ensured the Duchy of Lancaster was in future to be held separately from all other royal possessions and to descend only to his male heirs, effectively guaranteeing his family permanent tenure, whether or not they held the throne. In fact, the duchy stayed with the crown, forming an important source of revenue, and Lincoln once more became a royal castle. But the late medieval period saw a period of decline for both the city and castle. Outbreaks of plague, beginning with the Black Death in 1348, to 1349 killed a horrifying proportion of the population. A further blow came in 1353 when Lincoln lost the staple, a compulsory system channeling the trade in wool through specific towns to the downriver port of Boston. Wool was England's principal export at the time and a major source of revenue to the Crown, and the removal of the staple began a long period of economic stagnation for Lincoln. By the time of Henry VIII, the castle was no longer regarded as suitable for royal visitors. He and his fifth queen, Catherine Howard, visited the city in August 1541, and William Colborne, one of the heralds present, describes in detail the splendour of the occasion. With the king in green velvet and the queen in crimson red, they were welcomed by the major and rode into the city on horseback, attending a service in the cathedral and then retiring to their lodging. The next day his grace rode at afternoon to the castle and did view it and the city. This ceremonial occasion may have been part of a wider resurgence of royal power after a serious uprising in Lincolnshire in the late 1536, which, like the contemporary pilgrimage of Grace in Yorkshire, seems to have been largely religious in motivation. Following Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, all the monasteries and all other religious houses in England were swiftly closed, the buildings destroyed or sold off. Thanks all for watching. Do take care and have a fantastic week ahead.